I want to start this video off with a question. When I say Batman, what's the first thing that comes to mind? I imagine the first thing that you'll think of is something along the lines of this. Whether it be the films of Tim Burton, Christopher Nolan or Zack Snyder, the seminal 90s animated series, or beloved comic books written by the likes of Grant Morrison, Scott Snyder or Frank Miller, the popular perception of the Dark Knight today is largely that of a towering dark avenger of the night. Frank Miller, in particular, is often credited as the man who revitalised Batman and returned the character to his darker roots, shedding the skin of the Silver Age camp and the 60s TV show, and bringing the character back to what made him so popular in his early years, with stories such as The Dark Knight Returns and Batman Year One focusing on the complex and mature themes and ideas behind the cape and cowl. And while it's true that for a long time the public's perception of Batman was certainly more this than this, I think we often overlook one of the most important periods of the Caped Crusaders' history, and the incredible writer who attempted to return the character to his roots some 15 years before Frank Miller took centre stage. And that is Denny O'Neil. Now, O'Neil's recent passing has made me think a lot about the legacy of this legendary comic book writer and how often understated his role in reinvigorating and essentially saving the character of Batman is. So in this video, I want to explain what happened that caused the Batman comics to decline in the late 1960s and how the character almost found his books cancelled. And then how O'Neil and his frequent collaborator Neal Adams took the hero back to the roots of his early stories and expanded upon the classic mythos, creating many new brilliant characters and ideas, and how this series written by Denny O'Neil both revolutionised and saved the Dark Knight. The 1960s live-action Batman television series is still to this day one of the most well-known adaptations of the character, and one of the most beloved superhero TV shows of all time. The series, created by William Dozier for ABC, came about at the height of the Silver Age of comics, where many superheroes lost their gritty edge and became more light-hearted, family-friendly characters. And Batman is no exception to this. Within a handful of years he went from the brooding vigilante of the night to a playful father figure fighting aliens and wearing multicoloured costumes. And it's this campy version of the character that ABC brought to life in their show. And with this in mind, you'd expect that Batman comics were an all-time high during the mid-1960s. But actually, it was quite the opposite. You see, as early as 1964, 2 years prior to the show's premiere, executives at DC Comics were becoming increasingly worried about the future of the Caped Crusader, even going as far as to discuss actually cancelling the Batman comic book due to its poor sales. While the campy nature of the Silver Age comics of the late 50s and early 1960s had proved a great influence on the popular television series, these same stories had begun to wane on comic book readers by 1964, forcing those at DC to either adapt Batman into something more palatable for readers, or let the long-standing hero fade away into obscurity. In an attempt to salvage the character, Julius Schwartz was appointed editor of the Batman titles in May of 1964, and began to oversee notable changes to the character's status quo, best demonstrated by the new look blue and grey batsuit and the yellow bat insignia, which was debuted during his time. Alongside this new look, Schwartz removed many of the fantastical elements that dominated the 50s Batman comics, along with killing off Alfred in Detective Comics issue 328. Initially, Schwartz's plan appeared to be working. By 1968, sales of Batman had risen to make the hero the number 3 best-selling character in comics, only behind Superman and Archie. However, only a year later, The Dark Knight sales had begun to slump once again, with the character's titles barely cracking the top 10. It became clear that far more than cosmetic changes and minor status quo alterations were needed. In order to truly save Batman, DC had to entrust the character into the hands of exciting new creators who could move on from the style of the Silver Age camp and make a Batman that resonated with modern audiences. A call went out and was answered by two interesting choices. Artist Neal Adams, who had previously worked on the Batman adjacent Brave and the Bold comic book, and a writer who had made his name writing politically charged, social commentary stories in the pages of Wonder Woman and Green Lantern, Denny O'Neil. Adams and O'Neil officially took over as the Batman creative team as of January 1970's Detective Comics issue 395. However, the seeds for what would become their new status quo were planted in Batman issue 217 from that previous December. In this issue, written by Frank Robbins with art by Irv Novick, Dick Grayson graduates from high school and leaves Gotham to study at university, meaning that for the first time since 1940, Bruce Wayne now has to fight crime solo. Robin's departure forces Batman to return to his roots, once again becoming a lone shadow in the night sky. In a rather meta line, Bruce tells himself, "We're in grave danger of becoming outmoded, obsolete dodos of the mod world outside." From reading this issue alone, it was very clear that Batman was very much entering a new era, and these suspicions were confirmed once O'Neil and Adams took over the series the following month. When taking over Batman, Denny O'Neil claimed that his idea was to simply take it back to where it started. "I went to the DC library and read some of the early stories. I tried to get a sense of what Kane and Finger were after." This modern attempt of recapturing the magic of the comic's early stories are evident throughout many of O'Neil and Adams' initial Batman issues. As Dick Giordano, who penciled many of these issues, describes, "We went back to a grimmer, darker Batman, and I think that's why these stories did so well. There was no argument that the era of light-hearted camp had been and gone, and O'Neil and Adams' Batman wasn't to be a relic of the past any longer, but instead a forefather of a new, darker and mature era of comic books." What I think is worth noting first is that unlike many of the contemporary comic book creative teams that we know today, Denny O'Neil and Neal Adams' run on Batman is somewhat fragmented. Although the pair worked together on countless Dark Knight stories throughout the early 1970s, it wasn't always issue to issue as you might expect. Nevertheless though, we can look at a number of the stories created by the pair during this time and easily see the long-term impact that they had on the Batman character. The first Batman story told by Adams and O'Neil was The Secret of the Waiting Graves from Detective Comics issue 395, a story which immediately brought the Dark Knight back into his pulp-inspired roots. There's a big emphasis throughout this story on depicting Batman as a fearful figure terrifying criminals, as he investigates the mysterious secrets behind the villainous Juan and Dolores Muerto, a rich and eccentric couple who use Sybil flowers to grant immortality. On the surface level, this plot wouldn't have felt out of place in the Adam West TV series, but it's in the execution that makes this such a brilliant comic book, and a clear roadmap as to what Denny O'Neil's Batman was going to be. One of the most notable aspects of O'Neil and Adams' Batman relaunch came in 1973, when the pair brought back the iconic villain, the Joker, who at the time had disappeared from the pages of comics since 1969. As the Silver Age saw Batman comics become more silly and family friendly, the Joker had evolved from a sadistic killer in the Golden Age to the wacky prankster of the 60s TV series. And it was here in the Joker's five-way revenge story from Batman 251 that O'Neil would return the character to his homicidal roots. This comic book remains one of the archetypical Batman Joker stories. The Clown Prince of Crime hunts down 5 former henchmen who have all betrayed him, attempting to murder each one before Batman can stop him. Joker succeeds at killing the initial 4, but is prevented by the Caped Crusader in his final attempt, with Batman forced to go through an elaborate trap in a shark tank to free the criminal and best his arch enemy. This story did a tremendous job in not only bringing the Joker back into the mainstream, but also affirming him as the Dark Knight's arch enemy, a role that he would firmly grow into over the subsequent years. O'Neil greatly balanced the over-the-top elements of the Clown Prince of Crime in a way that treated his actions as sadistic instead of slapstick. To the Joker, it was funny, but to everyone else, it was unbridled terror. And although many of the great Joker stories came after O'Neil's time in writing the Batman title, many of the core elements that define a great Joker story now can be traced back to the Joker's five-way revenge. Likewise, Denny O'Neil also brought back another long-forgotten villain in the form of Two-Face, a character who had only made a handful of appearances since the mid-1950s, spotlighting him in Batman issue 234 and creating the template for the modern iterations of the now well-known villain. However, whilst O'Neil's tenure did see the resurgence of many classic foes, it was another brand new villain that took centre stage throughout his run, as in the pages of Batman issue 232 from June of 1971, the world was formally introduced to Ra's al Ghul. Partly inspired by the villains of popular James Bond films of the time, Ra's was created to be a physical and psychological test to Batman, unlike any of his other villains of the time, and someone who would take the hero's battles out of the streets of Gotham City and onto a global scale. Ra's was introduced as the leader of a secret criminal organisation, the League of Assassins, visiting Batman seeking help to rescue his kidnapped daughter Talia, with the Dark Knight aiding him in the search before Ra's betrays Batman and reveals himself to be the leader of the group that took his daughter, attempting to lure Batman to their base to test his skills as a worthy successor as the next leader of the League of Assassins. Ra's would then reappear 10 issues later, with Bruce faking his own death after Ra's learns of the hero's identity, using his alter ego of Matthews Malone to infiltrate the League of Assassins and attempt to defeat Ra's once and for all, only upon doing so, to discover that his foe was actually dead. Bruce would console a disparate Talia, all while Ra's body was secretly being transported to the Lazarus Pit and revived, returning to attack Batman and challenging him to a duel to the death. This would lead to an infamous shirtless sword fight between the two in the pages of Batman issue 244, as the two men fight for hours equal in skill, before Batman is poisoned by a scorpion and deemed defeated. Ra's would leave Batman to die, but Talia, kissing Bruce goodbye, secretly slipped him the antidote, with Batman reappearing and subduing Ra's as he and Talia once again embrace. And although these are only a handful of the many stories told by O'Neil and Adams throughout their run together, I think just by looking at these stories alone, you can see the change that they oversaw in terms of how Batman was presented and treated, with the stories of the early 70s very much focusing again on the darker, detective and pulp aspects of the character, very much bringing the spirit of the original 1930s and 40s comics back, but into an incredibly modern and 1970s inspired context. Denny O'Neil's contributions to the Batman mythos alongside Neal Adams can still be very much felt today, an incredible feat considering the pair's initial time together only lasted a total of 11 issues. Now, Adams definitely brought Batman to life in a way that very few other artists have, but O'Neil also told other brilliant Batman stories around this time with different artists as well. Namely, he teamed up with Dick Giordano on stories such as There Is No Hope in Crime Alley from Detective Comics issue 457, a personal favourite story of mine and one that focuses heavily on Bruce's childhood trauma after his parents' death, and introducing the character of Dr. Leslie Tompkins, very much telling the most complex early years Batman story up until Frank Miller's Batman Year One a decade later. In many ways, I think it's fair to argue that many of the aspects of the Batman character by writers such as Frank Miller and Alan Moore in the 1980s often built off the ideas and mythos set up by Denny O'Neil. Historian Les Daniels describes O'Neil's version of Batman as a vengeful obsessive-compulsive that also advanced the character's mythos in ways unlike any other writer since Bill Finger, and in turn influenced every subsequent version of The Dark Knight. Without O'Neil's stories throughout the 1970s, the wider perception of Batman today would still likely hark back to the camp and silliness of the Silver Age and the 60s television series, embracing the satirical comedy of the Caped Crusader, as opposed to embracing the rich themes and ideas at the core of the character. Now, this isn't to say that Batman stories can't be light-hearted and fun, of course they can, but in 1970, when Denny O'Neil took over writing Batman, the character had lost his identity and was as close to fading away into obscurity as he ever has been, O'Neil took over a Batman that had become stale and outmoded with the modern world, and revitalised him into a character that would set the precedent for the future direction of the comic book world as a whole. While he never wrote sweeping epic stories like Frank Miller, Alan Moore, Jeff Loeb, Grant Morrison or Scott Snyder did after him, it's clear that the successes shared by each of these writers and beyond were all built off the important foundations that writers such as O'Neil laid years before them. And I think that's why I feel so confident in calling Denny O'Neil the writer who saved Batman. And though his recent passing is sad and greatly unfortunate, I do hope that it will encourage us to go back and look at his legacy on the Dark Knight's titles, and acknowledge the role he played in bringing Batman out of the darkness and back into the spotlight that he truly deserves. Hey everyone, thank you so much for watching today's video. I hope you enjoyed it. If you did, please make sure to leave a like on the video and leave a comment down below as well. Let me know your thoughts on everything we talked about in today's video. What are your thoughts on Denny O'Neil's Batman run? And what is the legacy going to be of this amazing creator? Let me know down below. I can't wait to hear what you have to say as always. And if you're new to Owen Likes Comics, please consider hitting the subscribe button and the notify bell so you don't miss another video. And if you want some more videos, there should be some on screen right now that you might also enjoy. In particular, I want to give a big thanks and a big shout out to my friend Chris from ComicTropes, who has also made a really great Denny O'Neil video that came out late last week that's on his entire career, both at Marvel, DC and beyond. So if you want some more Denny O'Neil goodness, I highly recommend going and checking that out. If you want some more of me though, you can follow me on Twitter just at Owen Likes Comics. And if you want to help support the channel, you can do so at patreon.com/Owen Likes Comics. There should be a link on screen right now and also in the description. But that's all for this video. Thank you all so much for watching, and until next time, take care and keep reading.